Well, welcome back, everybody, to the Substack, and we're going to jump straight in because, as you know, we now have a regular ongoing discussion series between myself, Matt Goodwin, and Liam Halligan at When the Facts Change Substack. Again, essential reading. Liam, as you know, expert on the economy, well ahead of the curve on a lot of issues. I'm doing more of the politics, so we thought it'd be useful, given the time that we're in, for us to collaborate a little bit more regularly. And we're talking in the aftermath of the Reform Party conference, and obviously not just the Reform Party conference, but the Labour reshuffle. Keir Starmer entering phase two by completely reshuffling his top team. We've also had the date of the budget that's coming, and we've got a lot of interesting stuff that we want to get into in some real depth today. So I just wanted to start with initial reflections on the Reform conference, because Liam was there, I think, for the whole weekend. I was there for much of Friday, for briefly parts of Saturday. Liam, firstly, initial reactions to what you saw, this arguably one of the biggest conferences in Nigel Farage's political career.
Hey guys, let's be honest, what often passes for journalism today is little more than politically charged activism with a headline that's slapped on top. The truth gets buried under layers and layers of spin, agenda, and those algorithm-driven narratives, which is why I turn to Ground News. It cuts straight through all of that noise, and it shows you what's really going on. Ground News brings together headlines from about 50,000 sources across the globe. But what really makes it powerful is the transparency. You don't just see the stories, you actually see the political bias behind every source, the ownership ties, because let's be honest, we know that money influences coverage, and exactly how each side is covering the news. Have a look for yourself at ground.news/Goodwin. Take Britain's new Strategic Defence Review, for example. The government just announced plans for up to 12 new attack submarines and a £15 billion fund for nuclear warheads. Over 300 sources have covered this story, 32% from the left, 28% from the right, and 40% in the centre. But when we compare the headlines ourselves, we can see that The Independent focuses on how Labour pledged this massive defence boost under pressure from Donald Trump. Meanwhile, right-wing news framed this plan as putting the UK on a war footing to counter the immediate threat from Russia. Same story, but completely different angles. Now, my favourite feature is the blind spot feed, which surfaces stories that are ignored by the other side, like the fact that 4 in 10 babies born in Britain today have foreign-born parents. That story, well, it was covered 100% by the right, but not a single outlet in the centre or on the left reported it. So if you're tired of being pushed into these echo chambers and you want to actually understand what is going on, Ground News is a tool for you. Head over to ground.news/Goodwin, click the link in my description, or scan the QR code to get 40% off their Unlimited Vantage plan, which is the same one I use myself. More than 1 million people have already downloaded Ground News. If you care about seeing the full picture, you should be one of them. Check it out.
Indeed, incredibly eventful, Matt. Great to be back with you. I value this collaboration that we're building. I think our respective experiences and fields of interest really complement one another at this important time, as you say. Look, the Reform Party conference cannot be dismissed. There was wackiness, there was passion, there was energy, and you need all three of those things when it comes to launching a political movement, a serious political movement. And I think what's happened, Matt, over this summer is the UK's fiscal predicament has really come into focus, as we discussed last time, and I'm sure we'll touch on that again today. I think it's become really clear that Labour is really very left-wing compared to the Blair era. So the left really flexed its muscles on stopping welfare reform of any kind. That in turn spooked the bond markets. But what's also happened, Matt, is the political media class in this country has finally acknowledged what the likes of you and I have, seen coming for a very long time, that Nigel Farage could now, be Prime Minister, and it may be, and even probably will be. If you look at betting markets, they've been saying that for over a year now, but no one's wanted to acknowledge it. But the fact that the media class is now acknowledging it means that the shape of our media coverage will change to a degree. The tone of our media coverage will change to a degree. Reform are going to get a lot more coverage, and you're going to hear people on the BBC saying often, this bloke may be the next Prime Minister. That in turn will lead to a really huge increase in scrutiny, and rightly so. That's what I wrote about in my Telegraph column on Sunday. We'll come on to that. But it will also lead to a lot of ordinary people actually considering, maybe I should find out more about reform. The bloke at the office started talking about it. I always suspected he might be a supporter. He's now openly talking about it. The Overton window has massively shifted on immigration, another factor that we've seen over this summer that's really led up to this Reform Party conference. And look, it was part jamboree, part end of the pier show, right?
Yeah.
But this is politics. It was also a place where I saw, witnessed, was very much following serious politics going on at some of the fringe meetings, serious politics going on within our sort of media complex, serious politics going on with the various business figures I saw at the conference. And there weren't too many, but they weren't certainly saying that, they weren't advertising the fact that they were there. But if you're someone like me who hangs around in the City of London, talks to people in financial services a lot, has been in financial services, there were some pretty heavy people at that conference.
I noticed,
on nodding terms. They did want me to see that they were there, but I clocked them.
I noticed
So,
a lot of the mainstream.
In summary, I'd say that the conference couldn't really have gone better for Farage and his team, and actually the Angela Rayner resignation, it meant, we'll come on to it, completely upended the timetable of speaking. That annoyed some people who were there, but I think was the right decision in terms of their overall media strategy. Again, we can discuss that. And actually, the fact that Rayner resigned, massive story. A lot of the really heavy political journalists, got back on the train, back to London, and it meant there wasn't as much of that scrutiny that's coming as there may well have been, and there certainly will be in future reform conferences.
Yeah, there's a few things that struck me before we get onto the Labour reshuffle and some of the economic stuff. I mean, I wrote last night on the Stack about 5 key points that I took away, and I won't go through them all, but a couple of the big ones for me. Firstly, putting aside the fact this was the biggest, most impressive, well-organised conference I've ever been at, led by Nigel Farage. And I remember the ones in Frimpton-on-Sea, where there were, 200 people eating pieces of fruitcake because they self-described themselves as fruitcakes, embracing that David Cameron insult. I've been at the really crazy ones, right? And the Andrew Jenkins stuff, none of that stuff surprised me because Nigel was very clear when he came back. He wants this to be fun. He wants it to be different from Westminster. He wants it to be optimistic. But here are a couple of things. To be a constructive critic, someone that cares about my country, I do. Whoever becomes Prime Minister, I want this thing to work. I want it to be like Trump 2, not Trump 1. The first key point is managing expectations. I kept meeting people who think, what month 1 of a reform government, the country's going to be saved. And I've suggested in the Stack, Farage needs to start telling a story about what a reform government would look like. And I think he needs to be very clear that there's going to be 2 phases to it. Phase 1 is going to be basically rewiring the constitution, taking on the blob, dealing with the House of Lords, getting rid of the obstacles that are going to basically, the state is going to go to war with reform. Phase 2 will be, the getting things done phase. And I think he needs to start cultivating that story. I think the other thing that struck me is just how off the media narrative is when it comes to Farage. So we get this thing of it's a one-man band, he's a kind of pseudo-dictator, nobody else gets, any headway. Clearly, there was an attempt at this conference to push back at that because Nigel was very consciously presenting a team. But also, what very few people notice, he's now publicly discussing his limitations. In a Laura Kuenssberg interview on BBC, he said, look, we don't have government experience. Right, that's why I'm taking defections, because there was some chatter about Nadine Dorries. There has been a lot of chatter about Jake Berry. There's a lot of reformers saying, hang on a minute, why are we taking pro net zero, pro online safety bill, pro Boris Johnson people? Are these really reformers? Now, Nigel's pushing back on that, saying, well, look, I need people that understand top tier government, right? I need people who understand the state. So that is becoming a bit of a thread, that push for credibility, for government experience. And I think just lastly, and this again, I think I'm gonna put this back to you. There was a lack of detail around the economy, right? So we got the immigration stuff. Nigel's won that argument. Reformers won that argument. This morning I wake up, it's Monday, it's early September. Jenny Russell in the Times is making the case for scrapping indefinite leave to remain. Like the Overton window, as you say, is like gone 10 miles in reform's direction. The argument's won. The only people who haven't realised that are the kind of status obsessed liberal Tories, the Fraser Nelsons of the world. Most people understand we are in a completely new era. So Nigel's won that argument. I think he's won that argument. He's winning the argument on crime as well. If you look at the opinion polling that came out over the weekend, voters say, on balance, they trust Farage on immigration and they trust Farage on crime. So those are his two core issues. But there is this discussion now about, well, where's the economic stuff? And I'm going to come back to you on this because The Economist, the BBC, even the Times have all run pieces saying, yeah, okay, this is all well and good, detain and deport, leave the ECHR, but where is the detailed economic policy? What are you going to do on tax? What are you going to do on growth? What are you going to do on productivity? What are you going to do on debt? What are you going to do on all these things? What did you pick up when it comes to the economy, and what are you looking for when it comes to the economy?
I think characteristically, Matt, you've asked exactly the right question. The thrust of my Sunday Telegraph column, which I wrote, from Reform Conference, um, um, was exactly that: Reform are winning the argument on immigration. What about the economy? That was literally
Yeah,
the headline.
yeah,
There's there if you go back to Reform's contract for you, it's called. It came out in 2024, which basically morphed into their election manifesto. There is actually quite a lot of detailed policy in there. What there isn't is any sort of detailed attempt to show workings. Reform have got a growing, though still quite small, research department. They've got some, pretty sharp people knocking around who can use Excel spreadsheets and come up with credible fiscal modelling. But the details still very light. And I think that came out in Nick Robinson's quite bruising interview with Richard Tice before Reform Party conference, which I thought was fair enough. I'm not here to defend Nick Robinson and the BBC, but I thought it was fair enough. He obviously gave Richard a hard time, and Richard's big enough and ugly enough to look after himself, particularly when it comes to the economy. It strikes me he is a very financially literate guy. I've said that publicly in the past. I've talked to him quite a lot over the years about economics. He can read a balance sheet. He's run a business. And Nigel Farage can read a balance sheet and has run a business and was also a pretty good metals trader by reputation. So Nigel knows his way around macroeconomics as well. And I know that from talking to him on telly a lot over the GB News years. So there are two people at the top of the party, I would say, who, look, this is just an objective observation, are among the two most financially literate MPs I've ever met, right? The bar is low, but I have been shocked throughout my adult life how little economics senior politicians understand. You get some people who are economic visionaries. Nigel Lawson, right? One of the best economic minds of the late 20th century, in my view. You get other people like my late friend Frank Field, astonishing grasp of financial detail. Though not formally trained economist, he did do an economics degree, but intuitively really understood how the public finances worked. The vast majority of MPs, the vast majority of cabinet ministers, the majority of chancellors I've known haven't really got economics. Reform, first point, they've got people at the top of the party who do get economics. They, of course, have laid out, they want to raise the starting rate of income, the tax allowance from 12.5 grand roughly to 20 grand. They
Yeah.
want to raise the top rates 150 grand. On the business side, they want to put the VAT threshold up from 90 grand, where it currently is, to 150 grand. So you don't get plumbers stopping work in January so they don't pop the VAT threshold. I mean,
Yeah.
the VAT threshold where it is mad. All those things I can get on board with, right? I
Yeah.
really can. And indeed, I'm the person, or among the people, who were first advocating several of those things, though the numbers may have been slightly different. And yet you have to get there, and to get there, it may cost you money in the short term, or at least you're going to have to go to the financial market and say, look, we want to bring corporation tax down, which Reform want to do incrementally too. We want to raise the VAT threshold to get small businesses moving.
Yeah.
We want to raise the tax allowance to get people off benefits. There will be fiscal fiscal benefit from these things. Lower tax economies grow faster. We are beyond the peak of the lava curve, all that stuff. But you got to get there, right? And to get there, you have to tell financial markets, this is what we're doing. This is the direction of travel. We're still the UK. We've still got, in many areas, a world-class workforce. We've still got, decent infrastructure. We've still got London. We've still got a lot of the, entrepreneurial genius in the north of England. We've still got oil and gas in Scotland and elsewhere. You have to lay out a vision, right? And while you are laying out that vision, right, the state-funded economists are going to come for you, because they're going to say, oh, if you do that, it's going to cost you that, because they don't do dynamic modelling. It's just, if you lower income tax, they don't think, oh, well, that means people might work more and you might end up with more income tax. It means, that means there's a massive hole in the budget and everybody's going nuts. So you said in your opening gambit, and I completely agree with you, the state will go to war reform. Imagine, reform coming in and all the Sir Humphreys know that reform are coming for their public sector pensions. I mean, it's just going to be really, really tough, and reform have to get that going. But I think the real epicenter of the fight, both before and after the general election. Before the general election, of course, immigration is important. Of course, the Overton window shifted massively, but other parties will get there. Kemi is likely to say, we do need to leave the ECHR. Even Labour, you have 3 Labour grandees since we last spoke. Jack Straw, David Blunkett, Charles Clarke, former Home Secretaries, very, heavyweight politicians to this day. They can drive a headline, and they just did say, oh, of course we need to leave the ECHR. And I'm like, where were you 10 years ago, Jack?
Yeah, because they can see what's coming,
the Overton window shifted on those things, and that means, the point I made in my Telegraph column, right, reform on the economy are going to be less distinctive, right? The other parties will adopt their policies and try and neutralise. And then it will come down to the economy. Once everyone's on board, or most people are on board, of course we got to sort out immigration. Of course we have to. And let's see what Labour does between now and the next election. That means the economy will become centre stage. And while I totally agree with you, and I follow all your polling, Matt, and you've been well ahead of the curve when it comes to the salience of immigration in the public's mind, I'm not trying to detract from that in any way. But I still say, when it actually comes to the election, it's the economy, stupid. It is the economy, stupid.
Just on that,
they have to have credible narrative.
Just on that, because I think I completely agree with you. I think I wrote yesterday, riffing on some of the things you mentioned in our last conversation. My working assumption is public demand for reform is now only going to grow because we've got a Labour reshuffle. It's not going to deal with the fundamentals. Yes, Labour grandees are saying leave the ECHR, but the Labour Party will never commit to that. It will never commit to detain and deport. So the fundamentals on migration will basically continue to get worse. We've already seen day one of Shabana Mahmood, the small boat crossings over 30,000. She, is not going to get her arms around that. The economy, for reasons you've outlined, is only going to get worse, and I think the budget is going to exacerbate that. And I don't see any way back for the Tories, whether it's Kemi Badenoch or we're now hearing in Westminster rumours of Robert Jenrick moving against Badenoch in November. So I just don't think the Tories will come back. But let me just come on to this. It's the economy, stupid, because I agree with you. Why was Brexit
Yeah.
able to win? And Brexit was able to win because I would argue, even though some of the Tories would disagree with me, because what Farage had done 10 years before the Brexit vote is he had expanded the space for that campaign by linking Brexit with migration. It was the two issues merging that took it from a fringe issue among Eurosceptics in the 1990s, the Bill Cashes and the Sir Jimmy Goldsmiths, into what was a mainstream issue. Now, I think Farage has realised today the need to do something similar, which is keep his party anchored in migration, but use that as a narrative, as an arc, to get into two issues that I want to talk to you about. So, one is welfare reform. I gave a speech at Reform on Friday, and we had, it's really busy. We had lots of mainstream journalists there, and I was making the case as to why Reform have won the argument on migration. And I basically said, BBC Verify were being real with the British people. They'd be pointing out some of these studies that we now have, including, for example, David Miles, very respected professor, linked to the OBR, big migration expert. Well, he came out a few weeks ago and he said, look, our current model of mass migration no longer works. Is pushing us into a population trap whereby the capacity of the state to provide basic public services is being rapidly diminished because our population increase is so great. And what David Miles says openly is it makes much more sense to get Brits off welfare back into work, raise their skill level, raise their wages. It's a much better strategy longer term. By the way, raise their birth rates as well, if we can. But that's a much better strategy than relying on masses of cheap migrant labor from Uzbekistan and Nigeria, right? Because over the long term, that's putting unbearable pressure on your public services, is pushing you into a Ponzi scheme because you need more immigrants to service older immigrants because immigrants get older too. So you're on this never ending treadmill that's just getting faster and faster and faster. And I think, Farage could make more of that. He could say, look, immigration's been a disaster, everybody knows it. But now it's opened up some interesting political choices. Do we want to do more on welfare reform for our people? And look, I say openly, I believe in the principle of national preference. I think that's what our government should be doing. And also, secondly, housing. This astonishing stat I read over the weekend, and I had to double check it. In the first 3 months of this year, our government, Labour government, built 30,000 homes. 30,000 homes in the first 3 months of this year, which is the lowest figure since 2016. Now, to put that in context, more illegal migrants arrived in this country than we built houses. So the housing crisis is just getting worse and worse and worse. And I think Farage, again, could link, like he did with Brexit and migration, he could use the migration story to say, look, I now need to talk to you about some other political choices here. And we need to basically embed a principle of national preference into these decisions. In what other developed society do other nations give 13% of all of their housing to non-nationals? Where else does that happen except here? And I think these are things that the British people don't know about. Like they still don't know about the Boris wave. And Farage has to tell people a story about what has happened to the country, like he did with Brexit. Did you know this happened? Did you know free movement happened? Did you know this is linked to your EU membership? He now has to, I think, start a number of these other stories, particularly welfare reform and housing. What do you think about that?
I agree with you very much on the importance of that David Miles I agree with you very much on the importance of that David Miles intervention, and indeed he made a similar intervention about 6 months ago. He's not just linked to the OBR, of course. He's one of the members of the only 3 strong fiscal responsibility committee, along with the boss and the deputy boss of the OBR. He is by far and away the most sophisticated and well-respected economist at the OBR. The others are more sort of operatives. With respect to them, they're obviously smart people, and so again, that's helped to shift the Overton window on immigration, because you've had people like David Miles saying what they've been saying, that it isn't just, an unalloyed good fiscally immigration. There are downsides, particularly when you get to a certain point and when the societal friction is too great and the pace is too fast, all of which has been true. Farage was linking immigration to European Union membership, and you'll remember the numbers, Matt. I know they're seared on your mind as they are on mine. In the year before Brexit, we hit 363,000 net migration, and that was absolutely astonishing because up until 1997 we averaged 50,000 a year. 363,000, my God, it has to come down. And then of course since then we've been over 1 million net. It's just wow, Boris wave. By the way, the idea of Boris coming back to reform,
Well, just
I think
briefly,
that's mad,
your
but
your
it may
newspaper,
be possible.
The Telegraph pointed this out this morning with a phenomenal stat because they've done a deep dive into what caused the Boris wave, and they said in the 3 years after Boris Johnson became prime
Yeah.
minister, more people migrated into Britain than America, which is 40 times bigger than Britain, and 2.6 million people net added, and of those, 15%, 1.5, came in on high skilled worker visas. So when I was listening to Nadine Dorries say, oh, maybe Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage should work together, I was like, are you on crack cocaine? This is ridiculous. The worst idea ever. I mean,
Yeah.
if an architect came into your
I'll do
home,
you. Yeah.
if an architect came into your home, Liam, and destroyed your home, you wouldn't invite him back. And that, I'm sorry, that is what Boris Johnson did. He almost destroyed this country.
Our New York-born former Prime Minister, in his time in Number 10, trying to outdo Ellis Island. I mean, the historic ironies are just astonishing. Let me just finish the thought on housing and the economy, because I do want to come on to this sort of Nadine Dorries, Boris Johnson, what Nigel's doing. Nigel's saying, all we need, all kinds of people, kind of broaden, leaven the mix. I think there's some very interesting politics there, and I'm a political amateur compared to you, but I just want to try out some thoughts on you
Yeah, definitely.
see if they stack up. But just back to the economy, on housing, you're completely right. That 30,000 in 3 months number is just insane. Let me just put that in context as the author of Home Truths, Britain's Chronic Housing Shortage. So Labour are committed to 1.5 million homes a year. Literally as she was getting booted out the door, even though she was allowed to resign, despite an astonishing transgression of the ministerial code. I'm talking about Angela Rayner, of course. Remaining Labour cabinet ministers was, she's done so much. She's built 1.5 million homes a year. To build 1.5 million homes, we've never ever built 1.5 million homes in a parliament. In a parliament in 5 years in this country. And when we did, getting on for half those homes we built was social housing, like built actually. Either by the state, by state employed people, or on behalf of the state. So we've seen 30,000 homes built in total, so private sector as well, of course, under this Labour government in the first 3 months of the year. If you're going to build 1.5 million in a parliament, you need 300,000 a year. So she's done 30,000 in a quarter of a year, right? Yeah. So she, so far behind the pace, it's unbelievable. So that's and clearly housing is absolutely massive. I've kind of changed my mind on housing and immigration because, Matt, you know what? When the facts change, I change my mind. Right? Yeah. The name of my Substack, because when I wrote Home Truths, and I looked at the pace of immigration then, and I was, it was still 2016. I thought, well, 363 is obviously the peak. It's obviously got to come down now once these Brexit wars are over. I wrote the book in 2017, 2018. Then clearly immigration is going to come down. Yeah, little did I know. It's all my long-held view with other economists, reflecting my training, reflecting, frankly, my immigrant background, was that, but you need immigrants to build the houses. You know, I grew up in an Irish household. All my family, they're builders, right? We build houses. My family went to America and built houses. My family went to Australia, Canada, and built houses.
Yeah.
And so my line was, I think it's incendiary and actually analytically wrong to say, oh, all this immigration is the reason for high house prices. And I would say, no, that's not true, because you need the immigrants to build the houses. The problem is we're not building enough houses because the house building industry is oligopolistic. It does restrictive practices. It deliberately doesn't build enough to keep prices high, keep margins high, and all the rest of it. And a lot of that is still true. But when immigration is at the pace it is now, then economists are ridiculous to deny there's a problem. Ergo, David Miles, right? So things have changed. And I've talked to David Miles about this a lot over the years. And I'm not surprised at all that he has said what he has said. And linking that high immigration to the welfare reform bill, it's just incompatible to have universal benefit coverage and completely open borders, right? Which is why freedom of movement was nuts, which is why in the end, on balance, I backed Brexit. Other constitutional reasons, I don't like customs unions, all kinds of reasons. It's all in Clean Brexit, one of my other books. But in now you have to acknowledge, even as the son of an immigrant, even as somebody steeped in immigrant culture in this country, somebody who is incredibly proud of, I can get emotional thinking about it. Britain's ability over the years to bring in immigration, multicultural, successfully multicultural, because the pace of immigration was slower, community in which I grew up. Just a magical thing, and Britain is good at that. But at this pace, the immigration pace now, it's just too much. It's too much, and you're seeing the economic downsides and the fiscal downsides coming to the fore. And Nigel and Richard Tice, they have to, create that narrative. I completely agree with you, and the other parties will have to follow. Now, on Boris, on Nadine.
Just
Nadine
before,
Dorries, I've always had a soft spot for Nadine Dorries.
Sorry, I was just going to say, just before quickly getting to I want to discuss the Nadine thing too. So just before quickly getting to that, just to paint some context, paint a bit of context for that. We have had a discussion in and around the reform world and the commentary about, well, this is an outsider party moving to become an insider party of government, and it's going to have to do a number of things around policy development, drafting legislation, preparing a timetable for government, making a couple of hundred political appointments and building an ecosystem around it that is basically going to supply it with all of the things you need as a governing party. Now, the defections that have been coming, whether locally or nationally, have overwhelmingly been ex-conservatives. A couple of activists and members said to me at the conference on Friday, look, I didn't join an anti-establishment party for it to become a Tory tribute act. And there was clearly, I call it the face, because I was saying to people, what do you think about Nadine Dorries? And people would go, everywhere, anyone you ask, not quite sure. I'm being generous, but not quite sure. But I think, as I wrote in the piece yesterday,
The best quotes in journalism, sometimes you can't write down.
Yeah, right. And if I was,
you see how people feel.
Yeah, exactly. And I was just thinking, if I was Farage or in that team, I'd be saying, look, the next people that come across cannot be Tories. They have to be ex-Labour, have to be ex-Lib Dem, have to be none of the above, have to be business people, have to be celebrities, because the power of this revolt, people's revolt, is going to come from it genuinely being seen as neither left nor right, for the people against the establishment. That keeps it heading towards 40%. The more Tory MPs Nigel takes, the weaker his brand becomes in the Red Wall, the weaker it becomes in Wales, the weaker it becomes in Scotland. And there are lots of people out there, I think, who could get on board with a Katie Lamb a Suella Braverman, a Nick Timothy, but who will struggle not only with defectors being conservative or being Tory, but also being pro net zero, pro online safety bill, very close to Boris Johnson, who, of course, a lot of people rightly now treat with complete suspicion, if not contempt. And I think this is going to potentially become a really big strategic problem for Farage if they continue to take ex-Tory, ex-Tory, ex-Tory. Now, they might not. I've been told by people insiders that they're aware of this and they know, for every one they take, they're telling 5, 6, 7 they can't take them. And I think it's a really big issue. So I want to get your reaction to. In fact, I'll tell you something just briefly before I get your reaction to that. Because I wrote a piece saying anyone who defects to reform should be made to sign up to certain pledges, end migration, end mass immigration, oppose net zero, oppose woke ideology, reject the
I know.
Boris wave, and basically agree to these principles that separate reform from the Tories. And I don't think that went down well among some of the conservative defectors, one of whom I had a very frank conversation with. And, I said, look, I'm just going to be real with you. From my point of view, you guys basically destroyed the country. And I don't understand how somebody could go from telling us 12 months ago that the future of this country and the solutions to this country's problems is somebody like Tom Tugendhat, to then telling us 12 months later the answer is Nigel Farage. And I'm very suspicious of the Tories. I've said so publicly. I don't want if Boris Johnson were to join Reform, Liam, I would be the first person to say I want nothing to do with Reform. I would be the first person out the door to say, you know what, this is not it. This is not it. We have to, as a country, recover from the last 14 years, not put in place the people who presided over that complete policy fiasco and disaster zone, because the people deserve, my view is the people deserve more than that. But what do you think about the Nadine thing? And also, what do you think about the politics that are underpinning it?
Very interesting, Matt. So I've got a bit of a soft spot for Nadine, but I don't think she was necessarily the conference reveal that they needed at this time. Nadine, huge backer of Boris Johnson, as you say, now irrevocably associated with the Boris wave of immigration. Nadine wrote the online safety bill, which a lot of people at Reform don't like, which I don't like. She was very closely associated with some of the Tory policies which really wound up the public and which particularly wound up people who are now supporting Reform. On the other hand, she's a Scouser, she's a proper red waller in that sense. She's very proud of her northern roots, and she's somebody who's from a proper working class background, and she's a sort of bootstraps Tory who's pulled herself up and so on. And she's box office in the sense that she's got quite wide recognition. But I had exactly the same thoughts as you've outlined when I saw her come on stage, and I think it was for all her political experience, I think she said exactly the wrong thing in the aftermath of the publication of her defection by saying, well, maybe Boris can come too. There's something else going on here though, Matt. I completely agree with you that that Farage needs to get some Labour people on board. Lee Anderson's obviously ex-Labour. He is a star turn. I thought he performed very well at the conference. I was often in and around him as he was moving around, talking to people. He's a very, very good communicator. And I thought that one of the flourishes at the end of the conference, amidst the singing of God Save the king, or was it queen, and the visual image they wanted at the end of Nigel in the middle of a long line of people, many of whom were quite young, of people who had spoken at the conference. And just as an aside, there were a lot of young people at this conference.
Yeah, I
And they
agree with
weren't
that.
just young blokes either. There are a lot of young women at this conference. But we can maybe come on to that. It would be wrong for us not to have reported that in this chat, given that we were both there on the ground. But when it comes to, they need to get some Labour people. At the same time, though, right, in order to build his cephalological coalition to get to, Blair territory, a big majority that isn't wide and brittle like Starmer's majority, Starmer winning, just 33% of the vote on a 60% turnout. So he only got 20% of the electorate. So 4 out of 5 people didn't vote for him, even though he got a big headline majority. Blair got 43% of the vote on a 75% turnout, right?
Yeah.
Proper massive voting share, 13 million votes, right? Starmer got less than Corbyn in both Corbyn elections, by the way, as Vernon Bogdan and you and others have pointed out, quite soon after the general election result. So what Nigel needs to do, he does need to get Labour people in, but he also, to get this coalition, needs to get squeamish Tories in, right? Tories who didn't vote for Tom Tugendhat or didn't like Tom Tugendhat, the sort of lefty One Nation Tory candidate, who maybe think that James Cleverly's a good bloke, who are in the middle of that big Tory mass, who, like Kemi, think Generic's but might think Generic's a bit strong. But Nigel has to get those people in, right? So he has to, yes, take Tories who are signed up to the Matt Goodwin pledge card, right? But he also has to take Tories who existing Tories quite like, even though they're not on the right of the Tory party. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So he's edging deeper into the so-called centre ground. As the Overton window's shifting one way, he needs to go in that way in order to get more people. And so one or two One Nation Tories might be quite good, right?
I mean, I do notice
Boris Johnson is a One Nation Tory.
I do notice that
he
one
will
of
be
the
a step too far because he's so associated with the Boris wave of
no,
immigration.
absolutely. I mean, I do think that there are a few things that are going to clarify this picture. One will be the by-election picks over the next few months. There'll be people, who the parties select to run at by-elections will be revealing. Yeah. And I think over his right shoulder, Nigel will be aware, look, let's just be frank. There are a lot of people that think reform are too soft. Now, I've written extensively about why I think those people are in cloud cuckoo land. But, the people who are rallying around very small, largely insignificant parties led by people nobody's heard of. And also, by the way, I suspect a large number of people who will be marching in London to express their national pride and worry about immigration. A lot of those people are worried about the direction of travel within reform. Now, I've spoken quite directly to a lot of those people through my networks, and I've said, well, if you think leaving the ECHR, repealing the Human Rights Act, and overturning international treaties and refugee conventions that we've had for 70 years is too soft, then I'm afraid you are engaged in what's called a purity spiral, and you've lost touch with what is going to take to win Swindon and Tamworth and Milton Keynes. Because if you genuinely want to change the direction of this country, you've got to take the average voter with you. And the fact we're even saying we're going to leave the ECHR and repeal the Human Rights Act by a party that's on 35%, that in itself is mind-boggling if you really think about it and interrogate it. So if you're sat there going, no, actually, that's not tough enough, I want remigration of legal migrants, I mean, good luck. Go that direction, stand a candidate at the next by-election, and let's see how that goes down. But I do think, and this is key for me, whatever happens next, I do think it's going to be important for reform at a certain point in the next 3 months, because they did very well the deportation stuff. I noticed Zia Yusuf, I thought Zia did amazingly over the weekend, and he came out on GB News and he said, yeah, I support banning the burqa. There's no internal disagreement about that. I just didn't like the way it was handled in the House of Commons a couple of months ago. So, there are
Yeah.
clear attempts to shore up the right flank. But I do think when we are discussing the team, I think we need to see, somebody on that stage, on that symbolic stage that people can look at and think, yeah, that's a true reformer. That's somebody that's a real person that is committed to this ideology. That's not a Tory, that's not a softie, that's not a Mr. Whippy. That is somebody who genuinely, and I think that because carrying that vote, that kind of Eurosceptic anti-migration vote is ultimately what is underpinning reform, and they do need that. And there have been a few moments,
Yeah.
Richard Tice critiquing Stephen Edgington, Nigel's interview with Winston Marshall. There have been a couple of moments where it hasn't been managed quite as tightly as it should have been, right? And if they start to hemorrhage votes from core people, there'll be an enormous strategic risk in that. So I agree with everything you've just said. Catch all, go for that Big Ten. But that also means you have to stand people who are genuine, true believers over the next few months.
I think there's a lot in that. Just as the two top people, let's be frank, Farage and Tice, have to manage to square what I see as not their philosophical differences on the economy, but their strategic differences on the economy. I.e., Tice wants, let's just make the state a lot smaller now, because he's focused on financial markets and balance sheets and P&L, for want of a better phrase, profit and loss. Yeah, Nigel is the sort of dyed in the wool strategic politician, albeit one that's no slouch when it comes to economic analysis, and is philosophically as small state as Richard Tice is. He also knows that across the red wall, there's a lot to be said for keeping state spending quite high in some senses. So I agree with you. The sort of the macro political picture that you've outlined, just as I'm saying, they've got to come into the centre ground to scoop up, squeamish Tories who are entertaining the idea of reform privately, sort of arga chat, if you know what I mean. But they will often have been Tory voters for years, if not generations. They may even be activists. They're loyal people. They're people who like order by definition. They don't like big risks. It's a bit way out there. Their friends might not like the idea of them voting reform, but then they need to be able to say, well, look who's just joined reform. Crikey. Insert centre ground Tory. Now, you and your network, you have real reach, if I may say so, with respect, into that area of British politics that's kind of reform plus. The people who are really angry the way Nigel treated, say, Rupert Lowe or Ben Habib, the people that we referred to earlier with the smaller parties. And yet, those people, they're a much thinner tail, right? Where I'm saying they should move is into the fat centre, where there's lots of voters. You have an incredible network, but there are a smaller number of people there. I mean, and then the arithmetic takes over. But of course, he has to look over his right shoulder as he moves left, and he kind of rhetorically moved left by getting rid of Rupert Lowe and having this row with JD Vance, right? And JD Vance saying Rupert Lowe's the real guy because and Nigel distancing himself from Tommy Robinson, for instance, when Rupert Lowe wasn't. So rhetorically, he's pushed himself away from those people because he wants to appeal to the progressive dinner party circuit that's fast learning the facts of life, right? As their own financial circumstances start to look a bit queasy. But at the same time, Matt, it's almost unremarked upon. I know you feel this and know this to your fingertips, but it's almost unremarked upon. As he outed Rupert Lowe, Nigel basically moved to Rupert Lowe's position of deportations, over the summer, having previously been downplaying deportations. So in policy terms, he's doing one thing, while rhetorically and symbolically, he's doing another. And that reflects exactly the kind of push me, pull you situation that you and I have just outlined in our last sort of
I
two
did
answers to each
say,
other.
just briefly on that, because this is a really important point. You know, when a lot of people were very critical of Farage during the Rupert Lowe fallout, I did say to people at the time, because they were sort of presenting this picture of Nigel Farage, that having known him for 15 years, and I know you know him just as well, I just didn't recognize, you know, this picture of a kind of guy that was floating around, that was more interested in kind of becoming mates with David Cameron than being a conviction politician. It was like, what are you talking about? This is not Nigel Farage, you know, this kind of idea that he'd become a sellout. And it was always clear to me that Farage would move the Overton window in a pretty big way. And so when he came out with, you know, the deportation speech, you know, and it was, to be frank, to be honest, it went further than even I thought he'd go. You know, detain and deport, leave the ECHR, repeal the
Yeah, yeah,
HRA,
yeah,
disapply the
yeah,
1951 Refugee Convention, you know, immediate arrests, you know,
yeah,
offshore
yeah.
processing, the whole thing. I mean, he just went all in. And I don't think this was strategy. I don't think this was Nigel like positioning. I think it was Nigel. I think this is what Nigel thinks. This is what he believes. I think this is fundamentally a man who has always had a very instinctive, culturally conservative outlook. And I think part of it was about an awareness that Rupert Lowe was getting a lot of traction online. But Nigel will also have seen the polling that said nationally nobody knows who Rupert Lowe is. Everybody knows who Nigel is. He won't have felt Nigel will not have felt threatened by Rupert Lowe and Restore and so on. But I think he will have
Not for a second.
recognised
Not for a
he
second.
will have recognised that the national conversation on migration was quickly moving in that direction. You know, they will have done the polling over the summer. They will have looked at what voters were thinking and feeling. You know, he will have realized there was an opening. And also, don't forget, Nigel's very influenced by America. He will have seen the deportation strategy. He'll have seen the success of Trump. I know he's got, you know, networks in and around that world to people like you know, the border chief Tom Homan and so on. So I think there's a lot of that. And where he's standing now, I think, is the position on migration. So I don't think he really needs to say anything more on that. Just lastly, as we come towards the end, we've got just about 10 minutes left. I'd be saying a lot more about, you know, he's done the crime campaign, but I'd be literally highlighting this all the time, you know, shoplifting record high, complete disregard for law and order, and then just getting onto this economy point. The budget, let's just finish on the budget maybe, because we've got the date now, it's coming in November. The budget is probably going to be the most important moment in this country since the general election of 2024. And this budget is something that can go, you know, one of two ways. I mean, if you were Farage and Reform and you were talking to them, I know you do, like, you know, as a journalist, what would you be saying to Reform about how they can best prepare and brace for this budget?
Just before we do the budget, I just wanted to say, just because this is our kind of post-reform conference moment, and we might look back on it in future weeks and months. I also was on this platform at Reform as a Telegraph Planet Normal co-host with my friend Alison Pearson, and we interviewed Lucy Connolly. And I won't dwell on that. There's lots I could say about that. And
It's a
I'm going
great
to be writing
interview. I've watched
about
it.
why. Thank you. Why I thought that why I thought we should do that, and the importance of the fact that we did that. I've taken some personal blows for, you know, giving a platform to a convicted racist or whatever and I don't disregard the tweets that she did and so on, but let's not get bogged down in that. But just to say, when I put that idea, right, to the people at the very top of Reform, the idea that, Alison is going to get an interview with Lucy Connolly, we're going to be at the Reform Party conference, how do you think we should play this? The response was immediate and instant, and that's a great idea. That would be really interesting. And this woman, let's not have that discussion now. I'm sure we will have the discussion in the future. She walked in when Alice and I were on stage, instant standing ovation, right? She's the only other person apart from the leader who got that instant standing ovation, and it was really quite moving. Okay, so let's just park that. On the economy, 26th of November, Wednesday, a long way in the future. Crikey, endless months now of businesses not doing anything and not hiring anybody because they don't know what's going to happen. Endless months now of the housing market, remaining completely banjaxed. Sorry, London Irish word there. In order, because what's going to happen with stamp duty, what's going to happen with property taxation, yada, yada, yada. What are they waiting for, a miracle? I mean, why do it at the end of November? Did she not learn how mad it was last summer to say in July, we're going to wait till the end of October till we have a budget? So again, and then just brief the papers endlessly about tax rises that may or may not happen. If you sit on company boards, as I do, in the commercial and the charitable sector, these things matter. You don't take decisions because of what you're reading in the papers. It's completely mad what she's done. She has no understanding of business. It's just, I don't want to be overly personal, but it's ridiculous that the timing of this budget and the fear now on the bond markets, to sort of bring the conversation full circle. Why did I start writing really forceful stuff in February, March and April? Bond yields are going to go up a lot, and the fact that the Bank of England is going to lower interest rates is just going to make it worse, because you're going to open up this spread between Bank of England policy rates coming down and financial markets, these are the rates that count, pushing them up in the other direction. You're just signaling to the world, financial distress, we don't know what we're doing. The Bank of England has no credibility. The markets don't believe us. It's just a stupid thing to do. And a thought that I've been pointing forward for a long time has gone from being wacky worldview to near conventional wisdom now. Among financial denizens and the people who lend governments around the world serious money, the pension funds, the insurance companies, the sovereign wealth funds, people who even now some Labour front benchers just think you can let's just abolish the markets. I mean, some of the conversations I've had, thank God for the people involved, they were off the record, that's all I can say, and which of course I will honour. But the idea I'm talking about is this idea, and I mentioned it earlier, linked to the Laffer curve, that the Labour government has now got to the point, and the British public, both as households and firms and investors, has got to the point where if you push up tax rates more, if you pull that tax lever, and all the public sector economists will then instantly, as they say, score the fact that you're going to get all this extra money. You won't get the extra money.
Yeah.
You will not get the extra money, because the tax, you have to think about tax and economics dynamically. And tax changes that are bold in either direction change behaviour, particularly when you're at a high tax take. And our tax take was already at a 70-year high when the Tories came in, after years of what I can only describe as austerity, not austerity. Not to take away from any of the suffering that it caused, but as a big picture macroeconomist, somebody who should be saying things that are difficult to say. Over 10 years of Tory austerity, the national debt doubled as a share of GDP. So that is the fear now, Matt, that the budget pushes up taxes even more, all kinds of nasty taxes, because they said they won't raise national insurance, VAT, or income tax rates, which they might now do, and they'll find that they're desperate for some international event to blame it on, Trump's tariffs or whatever it may be. But that is the danger now, that Labour pulls the tax lever again and all the public sector economists go along with them, and then they forecast big increases in tax revenues and fiscal nirvana, and yet all you are actually doing, because you are mullering growth, you are crushing growth with these tax rates. In the end, the most important thing when it comes to fiscal policy isn't rates of tax or spending, it's growth, because growth lifts, the tide lifts all boats. Not that doesn't mean that everyone benefits from growth. It means the public finances unequivocally benefit from growth. You get more tax revenue at a given tax rate. You have less need for support spending, welfare, unemployment, or all the rest of it. And you move into a situation where you have a lower tax as share of a higher GDP, and you get us back to being where we should be, which is an economy where the state is 30 to 35% of GDP rather than 40 to 45% of GDP. We are not wired to have a state that's 40, 45% of GDP. Our economy and our welfare system is not built to have tax that's 40 to 45% of GDP. And, there aren't many rules in economics, Matt, but, it is axiomatically true throughout time, across the whole world, in human experience, that economies where there is less tax take overall grow faster, are more free, are more politically moderate. We have to get back to that point. And
okay, well, hold that thought,
because is so ridiculous.
Yeah, well, hold that thought, because we've hit the hour, and I want to keep it on the hour. So we've covered a lot of ground. We've covered the Reform Conference, defections, the politics of it, how Richard Tice, Nigel Farage can start thinking about the budget, thinking about the economy. We've got a load more stuff coming up throughout the autumn, obviously, as we gear up to the big budget, the ongoing Labour trials and tribulations, a return of potentially Corbynism with the new party, and of course we've got, well, let's hope, a number of by-elections coming up that I think will also feed into this, and maybe, who knows, an enormous crisis in France where, well, indeed. But anyway, listen, Liam, thank you for today, and thank you to everybody who's tuned in. As always, you can catch Liam at the When the Facts Change Substack. Of course, you can catch us as well on the Matt Goodwin Substack, and we're carrying on this kind of semi-regular conversation, if you like, about the political economy of the UK, given the severity of the problems that it's now facing. And I think it's fair to say there's a lot here you're not going to get from large parts of legacy media. So thank you for tuning in. Share it if you can, and we'll catch you in our next conversation. Thanks for now.